Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builders Supply. This video is to bring you a closer look at the Stanley FBB199 5x5 US10B. This is a hinge, is what it is. I have it removed here. This is an oil rub bronze hinge. The term oil rub bronze is often misused, is the bottom line. The reason I say that is because oil rubbed, you might look at this and say, well, that looks like it's black. Under these lighting conditions, it does look very dark. But the definition of oil rub bronze is one that permits it to be quite subject to interpretation. It's going to be lighter. It's going to be darker. With time, dark will become light, or lighter, especially on those pieces of hardware where you have contact with it. On a door that has true oil rubbed bronze material installed, like the FBB199, hinges, and then let's say a pull handle, kick plate, maybe a door stop, maybe a closer with a oil rubbed metal cover over it. The hinges will stay that color because no one's touching the hinges, but the handle, that's going to wear off, and just by touching the edge of the hinge, I'm getting that oil rub process, and I'm just restricting myself to holding it up here. That comes off, and it will continue to wear with time until eventually you are revealing some very beautiful bronze tones underneath. That's why I think oil rub bronze is a misused sort of definition to put on hardware, because it's never the same. Stanley imports this hinge from Asia, is my understanding. The very process of the chemistry of exactly the formula that's doing the oil rubbing, even at the altitude at which it's done at, will affect the final actual finish. This hinge, they could make another one in a month. They're not going to look identical. That's inherently what oil rubbed is, regardless of the base material. Now, this is an FBB199. The 199 means, among other things, it means it's made of solid bronze. So this is a true oil rub bronze in the sense that the base material is bronze and the finish is oil rubbed. So they could call this 613 because that would differentiate the base material from bronze like this to US10B when it's made of steel. So if you did this hinge as an FBB168, it would still be a heavyweight hinge, which is the other part of this, another part of it. But rather than being made of bronze, it would be made of steel. And again, you'd get a very different look. Okay, oil rub bronze is an awfully tricky finish because there is no uniform output. There is no uniform result. It is inherently subject to the environment in which it's created and how it's used. So understand accordingly, that's not oil rub bronze. Yes, it is, because the definition is very broad when it comes to oil rubbed. Now, what is the hinge? Let's dissect it now that we've talked about the finish. It's an FBB199. That means in no particular order. That means that this is a 5-knuckle hinge. You can see how it's a 5-knuckle hinge. It means it's a ball bearing hinge. It means that it is a full mortise hinge. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaf there, right at the tip of my finger there and there, that when you bring the leaves parallel, they're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame. That's a full mortise hinge. Okay? They're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame. It's a 199. That means it is heavyweight. If I put my caliper on this, this would measure 190 thousandths, or that's what it ought to measure in a 5-inch tall hinge. It is also a non-ferrous base material. It can be either stainless, brass, or bronze. Then the finish dictates the base material. This is bronze because it's oil rub bronze. You could do a FBB199 in a 32 or a 630 or a 32D finish. It's going to be heavyweight. It's going to be 5-knuckle, ball bearing. It's going to be non-ferrous base material, but it would be stainless steel base material, type 304. This hinge also means that it's a 4 bearing packet hinge. On a heavyweight, you're going to have 4 bearing packets. This is a really capable hinge. A 5x5 heavyweight hinge, you're going to expect to be able to swing a heavy door, 200 plus pounds. What really does all of the holding, the lifting of the door, the supporting of the door is that top hinge. Now, the question becomes is, it's guesswork in terms of what size this door is. It's obviously standard height or maybe taller. The client ordered one hinge, so I'm not really sure what the application will be in terms of the door itself. But the 5-inch can give us an idea of, well, it's possibly either just a larger than standard door or taller than standard door, or maybe heavier than standard. If it's an 1 3/4 thick door, 4.5 is pretty common. If you have something wider, heavier, possibly taller, resulting in it being heavier, a 5-inch is a really good option. You can go to 6-inch. You can go, in that sort of direction. When it comes to 5-inch, now I'm starting to think, well, maybe the door is not 1 3/4, because a standard size for an 1 3/4 would be either 4-inch or 4.5-inch. 5-inch tells me it's a 2-inch thick door, a 2 1/4-inch thick door, etc. So it's a little bit of guesswork involved there in terms of what's actually being done. But it's important to note that the height is the first dimension. It's a 5-inch tall hinge. It's important to know that when you say 5 by 5, the first 5 is the height. They go the opposite way that doors go. Okay, the width on this is 5-inch. Okay, now, sorry, my tape measure is having some problems. Okay, 5-inch wide. Why would you use this hinge? Well, as I said earlier, do I need a 5-inch tall hinge? Is it heavier? Is it wider? Possibly taller. If yes, go to 5-inch. It's actually standard practice for doors 3'6" and wider, and I generally like to do wider than 3 foot as automatically a 5-inch tall hinge. Any door that's heavier than 18 gauge, I will go with a taller hinge, because the height of that hinge, you go from 4.5 to 5-inch. I think the statistic is something about you increase its ability to carry the load by 21%. So it makes it a more efficient application of the hinge. The fact that it's 5-inch wide, though, could be trouble if they're using it on a door that's not thick, 2 1/4-inch or 2.5-inch. You really want or maybe it's perfect, but you do want that vertical axis of pivoting as close to the center of the thickness of the door as possible to give the door the best ability the hinge the best ability to be able to swing that door. The definition for determining the width of the hinge is a simple definition, but you do kind of have to study it a little bit. And you know what? We'll get to that when we get to the supporting documentation. So the height of the hinge is related to the width, weight, possibly the height. The width of the hinge is going to be absolutely related to the thickness of the door, but also the application. If you needed to move that pivot point out further to get around some trim that might be a little bit thicker, or a door that has a better inset, a deeper inset, yeah, you might need a wider hinge. But don't arbitrarily, just because it's 5-inch tall, doesn't mean it has to be 5-inch wide. You can get to why it's 5-inch tall, but then scrutinize, why am I asking for 5-inch wide? Would 4.5-inch be better? For instance, if you had a hollow metal frame that wrapped the wall, the typical hinge to use is 4.5, 4.5. It's a wood door and a steel frame, 1 3/4, 4.5, 4.5. That's great. Turns out it would be better if you used a 4.5 by 4. Move that pivot point in towards the door, center of the door. It makes the hinge more efficient, more capable of doing the job. Best practice would tell you to scrutinize that width, is what that would be. So we've talked about the FBB199 and the height. Just remember, the height is the first dimension. Doesn't matter. You can get by with thinking 5.5 by 5 by 5 is whatever width and then height. I got away with that ignorance for a couple of years, and then I learned why I was wrong. Client ordered 5 by 4.5s on a job of 20 doors. 2 of them were stairwells. They were 3.6 or 3.8, maybe 4.0. Client ordered 5 by 4.5, just like he should. I supplied 4.5 by 5. Client said, yeah, the hinges are supposed to be 5 by 4.5. And I said, well, they are. He says, no, my tape measure's on it, and it's 4.5 tall. I says, hold on one second. And then I quickly learned that the definition is backwards compared to how doors are measured. Turns out that they were very low frequency use. They were already heavyweight. They were you know, the client was okay. It didn't involve, and the frames were already set in masonry. So I got quite lucky that the client was like, they're going to be okay. Very low use. The fact that they're 5-inch wide is not, no, actually what the client said was, send me some 4.5-inch wide hinges. It'll look like everything else, and that's the way we'll leave it. Very, very nice gentleman. And ultimately it wasn't a problem, but nonetheless, it could have been a major problem where you've got to rip a frame out, supply new material, doors and frames, new hardware, the whole 9 yards. So we don't want to knowingly do that, certainly. And we don't want to, unfortunately, learn by the school of hard knocks, which I kind of escaped it on that one, but I've never made that mistake since. That's to be sure. Why is the height the first dimension on a hinge and the width on a door? Hard to say. You might conclude that one dimension is a little more important than the other, or one dimension more likely is, tell me that dimension first. You know, rather than say drive 200 miles, you might say drive north 200 miles. One thing, tell me that first, and then let's do it. So that's why I think the dimension. That's my opinion. Obviously going to be available in different sizes. We'll take a look at the cut sheet. Finishes, it's made of bronze. You can order if you ordered this in US3, it would be solid brass polished with a lacquer on it. Okay, it's really interesting oil rub bronze. As you kind of move around our world and see instances of bronze, you can see right on the tip of the hinge here that something's kind of touched it. It might be the package of screws that are included, revealing that bronze undertone. That's going to pretty much stay that color. It's going to. I noticed that oil rub picks up lint, and it's because it's literally, you can see it's still wet, and that's normal. That's how these show up. That's how that shows up to the job. Not everyone's oil rub is the same. Not everyone's is always the same. Not everyone's is as good as everyone else. But there's a formula to this chemical process, and it is a standardized process. So they're all attempting to do the same thing. Brass base material, bronze base material, stainless base material. You can do any of that in the FBB199. If you want a steel base, it'll be an FBB168. They literally use a different part number when the base material changes. So let's switch to the screen view and take a closer look at the supporting information. Okay, so here's the item we're looking at. And by the way, they're sold as each. When you buy one, we're going to ship you one. The question becomes, how many are in a box? Well, generally 3, but not always. You order some 8x6s or even 6x6 or 6x5. There may only be 2 in a box. Just be mindful. If you need 4, order 4. If you need 3, order 3, or whatever. They're sold and priced as each. For use on heavyweight doors or high-frequency doors in these types of applications. This has a template screw hole location, and I'll explain that when we get to the template. 5x5 heavyweight, and heavyweight means 0.190 on the leaf thickness. A 4.5-inch tall hinge in a heavyweight would be 180 thousandths. A 6 and an 8-inch tall would be different as well. A thicker hinge. I think the 8x8 is a 1/4 inch thick, 0.250 on the thickness. Brass or bronze base material, depending on your finish. 5-knuckle, reversible flush tips and pin. If for some reason you needed to drive that pin out, you can, and that they are reversible. I would separate that hinge in the process of hanging the door, but otherwise I wouldn't remove it. Hole in bottom tip for easy pin removal. That is what they're saying there is in the bottom button tip. There is an access hole where you can drive a small center punch into and carefully tap the hinge pin out. You'll do that again to separate the leaves, put one on the frame, put one on the door, bring the door to the frame, tap the hinge pins down through the assembly, and then your door is hung. This pin is stainless steel in this case. You would want a more durable material on a heavyweight hinge, and the pin takes a lot of it's what's keeping the knuckles together, so it takes all the lateral force. 4 Stanley permanently lubricated non-detachable ball bearings. Oil rubbed. Pin type is removable. You can order security options on this. Non-removable pin, security stud. Let's look at the tech drawing first. So this is simply a document that shows you where the locations of the holes are for the screws. And it does so for different part numbers of the hinge. Okay, so we're dealing with an FBB199. It's a non-ferrous hinge, so this is our column, which is a 190 thousandths thick leaf. And they have this for 5x4, 5x4.5, 5x5, 7 and 8 inch. The 7 and 8 inch are considered wide throw hinges. And again, if you're doing an 1 3/4 thick door, 4 inch could be the right size. Maybe you need 4.5, but if your frame wraps the wall and you don't need to go to 180 degree, or even if you did and there was no obstruction, 4 inch would be the right hinge to use. So that this document is helpful because it will show you where the location is for the screws. You might say to yourself, how do I know if this hinge is going to fit? Well, here's how you know. Here's the location of the screw holes. Very handy. Installation template. Okay, this is a rogue document. This just talks about attaching the material. Quite frankly, it's not appropriate for this hinge. Hinge size. This is another rogue document that we'll leave here, but this is for Stanley owns National. National makes hinges that may be under the Stanley brand now, or maybe it's called Stanley National. That's a holdover document. Let's get to the good stuff. The link here to the manufacturer's page, right here. That's going to allow us to pull up not only all of the Stanley products that we sell, but also a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to their several and many product catalogs. The one that works best for me is an older document called 2010 Architectural Hardware Catalog. The description, the definitions, the way that the manufacturer approaches stating plainly what a hinge is has not changed. So this decade-old document works just fine for our purpose. Because we're going to talk about hinge information. As you scroll through, you can learn quickly the difference between full mortise, which is what our hinge is, and other types. That's a half mortise, that's a half surface, that's a full surface, that's a swing clear. That's a swing clear half surface is what that is. That's a pivot, some sort of pivot. Yeah, reinforced. Okay, that's a hinge with a reinforcement in the top for really high-use doors. I was in a class in the Canadian Door Hardware Institute, and they had one of the instructors did a job, and he says that was 30 years ago, and those hinges still are like the day we put them in. Very, very durable. This is a usage chart. Depending on the weight of the door, they're going to tell you what to use. Okay, so the CB, the 168, that's a concealed bearing. That's going to be a different construction. So this is a handy document to use. I personally would not exceed 225 pounds with this FBB199. And if I did, I would certainly use this chart for their concealed bearing. It's a more efficient way to carry the weight of the door. You get into some heavy stuff, and you're going to see how the height of the hinge is what changes as you follow the mouse down. The heavier the door, the taller the hinge gets. Well, this BB855, that's a very different type of hinge. I think that's a detention hinge, where the steel is 3/8 thick or thicker. But up to doors that have these CB168s, a concealed bearing, I think it's 3-knuckle. Actually, I'm positive it is. As you get heavier, that height of that hinge increases. Okay, so a handy document. Now, here is how we talk about the width of the hinge. How wide of a hinge does your application call for? And let's talk about that. So, the formula for determining that is simply the door thickness minus the backset. The backset is the dimension from the edge of the hinge to the push side of the door that you are not mortising. Generally, it's a 1/4 inch. Okay? So, door thickness minus backset times 2. Let's just do it. 1 3/4 wide minus the backset is 1/4 inch, which is 1.5 inches times 2 is 3 inch. Then you add your clearance. Okay. Then you add your inset, which is the dimension from the face of the frame to the face of the door. That's usually quite small, like 3/32 of an inch, 90 thousandths, something very small. So at this point, we're at 3 inch. Let's say that your clearance is, you know, basically nothing. Let's say your door is not even going to go past 90 degree. You don't have anything to really get around, and that it's a frame that wraps the wall like this. Your dimension's still at 3 inch because it's basically 0 here. You add your inset, you go to the next biggest size. You can see where a 4 inch wide hinge is appropriate. There are no 3 inch wide, so you'd go to the next largest size. And you can play with door thickness minus backset times 2, plus your clearance, plus your inset. That's the width of the hinge. So when your door is at 180 degree, that's what you're measuring. So this formula is important when you are trying to verify what you have is accurate. It's also very helpful to allow you to get a bit more exotic when you are working on something. I have seen openings like this. Okay. This door is going to swing to here. 180 degrees. Now it's going to look like okay. Then what they want is both of these to swing out this way. Or actually, no, it would be better if we did it this way. You're going to have this door swing this way. So now you've got this, you've got this, you now have this. Oh, yeah, here we go. All of this is going to swing this way. You can use it to calculate how wide of a hinge you need to accomplish everything. The hinge between here and here can be very, very small because you want that clearance to be as close to 0 between these two doors as much as possible. The margin right here. But back to our prior where you were going this way and taking all of this and going out this way, now you can start to say to yourself, oh, I see why that's a very important formula to draw on, so that you don't have the doors needlessly stacking very far apart from each other. You know, keep them as tight together as possible, reducing this. This comes up. This sort of application comes up often. I have clients that need to be able to stack doors this way. And depending on how you're going to go about doing it, you know, you're going to need to think that through. And that formula is very helpful in that regard. It will allow you to get as close to what you need as possible. Now, there's a tremendous amount of valuable information in here to be sure. Let's get right to the FBB199 cut sheet. And I'm just scrolling through the catalog to find our document. Here it is. So FBB199, it's on the same page as the 168. Okay. It tells us that we are dealing with, so a description of the hinge, as we've gone over, talks about the options. You can get this with a raised barrel hinge. That is a, I'll leave that for you to research in the catalog, what a raised barrel hinge is if you're unsure. Very neat hinge that every once in a while you really need a raised barrel hinge. Hospital tips, that would be where they alter the hinge so that there is no part of the hinge that something can be hung on, like a coat or a hat or a belt or a shoestring, or anything that someone could use to harm themselves. Decorative tips, urn, steeple, ball, acorn. Security studs and NRP are two different security options. They can be used exclusively. They can be used together. NRP is by far the typical one. If you have an outswing door that swings out, you'll at least want non-removable pin. If you want the belt and suspenders approach, add the security studs. and that can be discussed here as well. It basically, even if you drove the pin out, really reduces the ability to pull the door out of the opening. You've got to spread the door and frame open to get the door out with security studs. Sizes, as we talked about earlier, I was wrong. It's .203, not .25 on an 8-inch tall. But you can see how the sizes run in these heavyweights. You get into some pretty heavy doors, you want that weight that height to increase, as I said earlier. Okay. 3 in a box. Case quantity, how heavy the cases are. Again, priced and sold per Hinge. It's a very handy document. The selection of the hinge is super important. It's literally the backbone of the door, and picking the right one is the way to go. Let's wrap up this video on camera, and we'll just touch on those primary rules of thumb as it comes to selecting the size of the hinge. Now, in conclusion, if you've got a door that's standard and it's 1 3/4, use a 4.5-inch hinge. If it's residential, use a 4-inch hinge in the height. In the width, if you've got an 1 3/4 thick door, you can make a 4-inch work, 4.5 work. If you have an 1 3/8 door, 3.5 is going to be the width. We're not talking about 3.5 with such a hinge, naturally. That's the bag that oil-rubbed hinge came out of. If you have a door that's heavier, taller, wider in any respect, think about a taller hinge. Think about a wider hinge. The wider hinge, we talked about how to determine that. Just because it's 5-inch tall again, don't mean you need 5-inch wide. And it's very likely that you don't. I've had a customer, a local golf course country club here in Naples, and they had 5x5s and replacing all the hardware. And I said to the client, you know, you've got 5-inch wide hinges. You don't need that at all. These doors cannot go past 90. The hinge barrel, the vertical axis of pivoting, is hanging too far off the face of the door and frame. Let's bring that back closer, because it was literally the main doors to the space. And to me, it also looked incorrect. When I looked at how proud the hinge barrel was standing from the face of the door and frame, I said, that's wrong. It's too much. He elected to keep it that way just because that's what we got here. Let's just leave it that way. But the point is a better, best practice would have called for, they could have got away with a 4-inch wide on that one. Screws are included in a complimentary finish. Be mindful, they are non-ferrous. It's possible those are stainless. They appear to be slightly magnetic, which you would expect from stainless. But when it's non-magnetic, you have to assume that they could be brass, which means that you need to pre-drill that hole. If it's softwood, probably about 70% of the root diameter, maybe 75%. If it's hardwood, maybe 80% of the root diameter. Make sure you pre-drill that real well. Good fitting tip, and put that in. Don't strip it, don't split it, don't shear it. That's a problem. Stanley hinges will include shims. This is the cardboard shim. They are included with Stanley hinges. These shims are also sold separately. You can buy these in a box of 100. If you have a fire-rated door, don't use cardboard shims. Use only steel shims. And as the joke goes, if you're going to use cardboard shims on a fire door, use your competitor's business card. In all seriousness, in a fire door, only steel shims. But it's at least nice the factory does supply you with a shim. And I'm not aware of anyone else who actually does that. Someone else must, but not coming to mind. I'm partial to Stanley. I don't do a lot of Stanley business, but I'm partial to them because I really like their fit and finish. The tolerance on their hinge leaves is always really good. The hinge always swings very smoothly. You'll get some hinges from manufacturers where immediately it doesn't even swing well or move well, and you have to get load on the hinge in order for it to actually move. But that Stanley is always a smooth hinge. Fun fact, we just sold a client Stanley hinges. Forgive me. This was a Thomas Edison museum in New England somewhere. I don't recall. Stanley's lead time was epic because it's coming from overseas. The original hinges in this museum dated from the mid-century. They were clearly Stanley hinges because of their bearing design. It was clear that they were Stanley. We replaced them with a 100% American-made product by Bomber, only because of lead time. But that Stanley hinge, and they were only replacing it after 70 years about, because they were going with a different color. And that was a bit of a shame because the hinge worked in 2020 as it did in 1950. So really, really neat aspect. And it was a shame to replace it with another manufacturer. But this world wasn't built on an 8-week lead time. If you have any questions on the FBB199 5x5 and a oil-rubbed bronze finish or any other Stanley product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.